evening to everyone. I'm Barbara Brown. I'm chairperson of the Eastern Queens Alliance, and I'm serving as one of the moderators this evening. Gloria Boyce-Charles, whom you'll hear from in a few, is our vice chair and is the other moderator. EQA, by the way, is a nonprofit federation of civics in southeastern Queens. It existed for about 30 years, and we work on issues that cut across communities that impact our quality of life. And one of the things that we have realized is that a major contributor to that quality of life is the environment in which we live and work and play, and that it's a real force in our community. So we're very excited about this forum. It's a topic that matters to us all, and it's the first in a series of such forums which will look at related topics. What we have realized is that there is a seeming misunderstanding among many of the people that we speak to when we talk about the term environment. When we use that term, many people seem to think that we are talking about grass and trees, when in actuality, we know that the environment is a critical issue. So in seeking solutions to the problems, we are looking for solutions that involve the total picture, the larger picture, and not just the low-hanging, what we call sometimes low-hanging fruit, because very often people are looking for quick fixes. So they might look at building a community center, or look at the fact that we have a shortage of hospitals in the area, or look at the fact that the school achievement levels are low, but environment is not factored into that picture and is not factored in as actually the underpinning of a lot of the problems. So our goal here tonight is to totally unwrap, to lay bare the concept of what environment means, and what does environmental justice mean, and what does environmental and systemic racism mean, and even talk about, well, what are sacrificed communities and what is climate change? And so we want to unwrap all of those terms so that everybody here has a basic understanding of what that means, and then talk about perhaps how then we can ameliorate and mitigate situations that are impacting us where environment is an underpinning. We have a wonderful panel of experts with us to unwrap these concepts and explore how we can use them. And so we're going to be moving forward. We're pleased to have an audience of people from near and far, of people from a wide range of disciplines here on this Zoom call. We have people from a variety of professional affiliations, of environmental activists. We have organizations, civic organizations, and organizations focusing on many different types of things, including health. We have people who are in law programs, lawyers, community board members, civics, churches. So we have really a wide range of people here with us, and we welcome all of you. A couple of housekeeping items. First of all, everyone is on mute and will be kept on mute until possibly we get to the question and answer period. And so we ask that as you listen, please write down your questions in the chat room, and we will address them when we get to the Q&A. We think we are on Facebook Live at Eastern Queens Alliance, Inc. And I say think because this is a technology that we're learning. So we're supposed to be on Facebook Live. We are recording, and we will be posting the recording on the website later if that becomes necessary. But again, welcome. And I now turn the program over to Gloria Boyce-Charles, our moderator and our second vice chair.
Greetings and blessings to all. This evening, we're going to have a wonderful opportunity to learn about and problem solve or begin to think about the challenging environmental justice issues of our day. We want to begin by being thoughtful about the fact that environmental justice is a civil, a human, and a legal right. And in the past few days, our nation and our world have been saddened by the loss of three courageous civil rights leaders. Minister Cordy Tyndall Vivian, also known as C.T. Vivian, Georgia Congressman John Robert Lewis, and brother of the late Medgar Evers and civil rights activist in his own right, Mr. Charles Evers. We owe these people a great debt of gratitude for their courage and their sacrifice. And we ask that we please just observe a moment of silence for them at this time. Thank you. So tonight, we're privileged to be joined by three environmental activists and scholars who are uniquely qualified to address the dynamic and increasingly critical topic of environmental justice. I'd like to take a few minutes before I let them speak, just to introduce each one of them. For more complete biographies on each, you can just refer to the PDF that I sent out in the reminder notice that was forwarded to you earlier today. Sometimes you may hear a little airplane noise in the background. Apologies in advance. All right, now I'm gonna do this in alpha order, but questions will not be asked in alpha order. So we're joined by Rebecca M. Bratspies, a law professor at the City University of New York School of Law. Ms. Bratspies is the founding director of the Center for Urban Environmental Reform. And she is a internationally recognized expert on environmental justice, the regulation of new agricultural technologies, and the human right to a healthy environment. Ms. Bratspies has written extensively on the subject and has published 4 books. She is also bringing environmental literacy to a whole new generation through her environmentally themed comic books, Maya's Lot and Bina's Plant. And she has recently published We All Count, a comic book and coloring book to help educate families and communities about the importance of the census. We have Dr. Robert Bullard, who is a distinguished professor of urban planning and environmental policy at Texas Southern University in Houston. He is the co-chair of the National Black Environmental Network. Professor Bullard is often called the father of environmental justice. He is an award-winning author of 18 books that address environmental justice in such areas as sustainable development, environmental racism, urban land use, industrial facility siting, housing, transportation, and community resilience, just to name a few. And I'm sure that you can find your own community's needs somewhere among the many works that he's put out there. His book, Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and Environmental Quality, was the first book to introduce readers to the discipline of environmental justice and is a standard text in the field, in the discipline. And we have Ms. Peggy Shepherd. Peggy Shepherd is the co-founder and the executive director of WeAct for Environmental Justice. She serves on the executive committee of the National Black Environmental Network and was the first female chair of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Ms. Shepherd has a long history of organizing and engaging Northern Manhattan residents in community-based planning and campaigns to address environmental protection and environmental health policy. She has successfully combined grassroots organizing, environmental advocacy, and community-based research to become a national leader in environmental policy and justice in urban communities. So these are our renowned speakers, and we are really so privileged to have them join us this evening and to share their scholarship and their experience. I'd like to begin the discussion by allowing them to say a little bit more about themselves, and in particular, to talk a little bit about the defining moment that made them, or moments that kind of led them to this path of environmental activism. And beyond that, you know, what their current day missions, constituents, and initiatives are in the discipline. So I'd like to begin with Ms. Shepherd, because recently I was taking a look at an interview you've done with Cheryl McCarthy, and understood that you began as a journalist some years ago, and through your engagement with the community and the Jesse Jackson campaign, got involved in some things that led you to this direction. So maybe you could share that a little bit with us, and then the others will take turns. Mm-hmm.
Sure, thank you, and good evening
Good
to
evening.
all of you.
Good evening.
Pleasure to be with you again. It's been a while since I was at your luncheon out in Queens some years ago.
Yeah.
So yes, I began my career as a journalist and a magazine editor, and began working in political campaigns. And someone asked me, Bill Lynch, if you remember, who managed David Dinkins' campaign to become the first Black mayor. He asked me if I wanted to be a behind the scenes person or out in front. And so he suggested that I run for Democratic District Leader in West Harlem. And he linked me together with Chuck Sutton, who was Percy Sutton's nephew. Most of you know, certainly Percy Sutton, the former Manhattan Borough president. And we were elected on a slate to bring a new type of politics to Harlem. And while I was organizing folks and recruiting volunteers, one volunteer came and said, there's a sewage treatment plant that's being developed in the Hudson River, and are you going to get us jobs? And so Chuck and I set about getting jobs because, you know, the Suttons owned WLIB and WBLS. And so we were on radio all the time, and we exhorted all these people to go get a job, go down to DEP. And the next thing we knew was that the DEP commissioner was calling us to actually curse us out for having sent people down there. But we did get 30 people hired. But then the unexpected consequence was that the plant began operating and spewing emissions and odors that were making everyone sick. So we developed a campaign with Mayor Koch. As you know, Mayor Koch really did not interact with people of color or elected officials of color. And so he stonewalled for 8 years that there was no problem. We must be imagining the emissions. And so when David Dinkins became mayor, he said, there's a problem and we're going to fix it. And he did. He committed $55 million to fix a brand new plant. We sued the city. We sued my good friend David Dinkins, who grew up with my father in Trenton, New Jersey. And we sued David, our good friend, because we realized that he would not always be in office, and we needed a mandate for what would happen at that plant. And so that was our first real organizing campaign. And of course, once you see one issue, you look around and you find others. And so we began to understand that we housed over 1/3 of the New York City diesel bus fleet, which is the largest in the nation. And we began to reach out to Harlem Hospital and the Columbia School of Public Health to understand, well, were you seeing more hospitalizations coming from our zip codes because of this plant? And then a couple of years later, because research takes a while, Jean Ford, who was head of pulmonary medicine at Harlem Hospital, called me and said, you know, we're about to publish this new study, and it shows that people in Harlem are experiencing asthma at 3 times the rate of folks in other neighborhoods. And so that really began our strong focus on air quality, which has continued to this day. But of course, We now got a $1.1 million environmental benefits settlement of our lawsuit from the mayor. And we got a grant from that to start our organization with a paid staff. And so over the years, as the environmental justice movement has really matured, we certainly work on stopping pollution, but we're also concerned about bringing green benefits to our communities and organizing residents to engage in policy making, which really impacts the health and sustainability of our communities. So that's how I got started, and I'll stop there.
Great. That's a really, I think that's just a fascinating story. And what interests me about it was that initially what came into the community and seemed like something that would offer a benefit, you began to see that there were some things that weren't working for you as a community, and you had to kind of pivot and address those things. So jobs weren't the only thing that mattered at the end of the day, right?
That's right. And of course, they put a park on top. So we have a huge, incredible state park on top of the sewage treatment plant. And we wanted to also make sure that people using that park would be healthy and safe. So again, the emissions from that plant continues to be an issue that we monitor. It's certainly better, but facilities like that really depend on the maintenance of those facilities. So it's something that we always have to monitor. And that's a big part of environmental justice. It's not just stopping stuff or bringing good things. You also have to monitor these facilities and monitor that the policies you think you put in place are actually being implemented in the right way.
And the monitoring that you do through funding that you get, and you do that independent of the agencies that are affiliated. You do that on your own?
Correct. That's correct. We fundraise from individual foundations and individual donors.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. This is very enlightening and helpful. How about Dr. Bullard? Would you like to share your defining moment, how you got involved as an environmental activist?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me, and I'm glad it worked out in terms of schedule-wise.
Yeah.
I would love to come to Queens. Just didn't work out.
We would have loved to have had you here. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me just take you back ancient history. 3 years out of graduate school, my wife and I were involved in a major lawsuit, and I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm an environmental sociologist, and my wife is a lawyer, and one day she came home and said, "Bob, I've just sued the state of Texas and the city of Houston and Harris County." And I said, "You sued the state of Texas?" She said, "Right." I said, "Well, I work for the state of Texas. I work for a state university." So she actually sued my employer. So she said, "I need someone to collect data for this lawsuit because this company is trying to put this sanitary landfill in the middle of this predominantly Black middle-class suburban community. And we know there's nothing sanitary about a landfill. That's where garbage goes, and it doesn't go to garbage heaven. It goes to a landfill, incinerator, or some type of facility. Where in New York City, I think there are marine barges and all that stuff. But we don't have that down here. It goes to a landfill, a dump. And she said, "I need someone to collect data for this lawsuit, and I need someone who can put on a map where all the landfills, incinerators, and dumps are located from the 20s or the 30s up until 1978. And I said, "You need a sociologist." She said, "That's what you are, right?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, you're it." And she said, "You're all I got." So I had 10 students in my research methods class at Texas Southern University, and I told my students, we have a research project, and that locating solid waste facilities in Houston from the beginning up until 78 was a humongous task, because there was no Google GIS mapping, there was no laptop, iPads, none of that. And so it was, we designed a study, and we were able to collect the data and report it out in 79. We were in federal court. And what the study showed is that 5 out of 5 of the city-owned landfills in Houston, 6 out of 8 of the city-owned incinerators in Houston, and 3 out of 4 of the privately-owned landfills in Houston were located in predominantly Black communities. Now, that's like me saying my family is predominantly Black. These are all Black neighborhoods in Houston, and how we know Jim Crow did it. And so from the 30s up until 1978, 82% of all the garbage waste dumped in Houston was dumped in Black neighborhoods, even though Blacks made up only 25% of the population. That was my aha moment. Even though we had the data, we had the findings, we had the statistics, we had all of the information. When we were in federal court in 1979, we was in front of a judge that must have been a 150-year-old white man that called us niggers. If you know anything about down south, when you are called a nigger, that's shorthand for the N-word. And we lost in court because we could not prove that this was intentional discrimination. And so what it showed me, that having the facts, and even though I published a bunch of articles and it was good enough scientifically to be in a referee journal, it was not good enough to be in court. And so that moment led me to fight harder and to expand the Houston study to look at other kinds of poisoning facilities that was dumping on Black people. And I looked across the South, and that's how Dumping in Dixie, the book, came about. And I wanted to know, is this just a Southern thing? And then I started to do more research and find out, oh, this ain't just the South. You got the South up in New York City, and you got the South in Chicago, you got the South in LA, you got the South, it's all over the country. Racism was systemic, and it was stamped in America's DNA from the very beginning, 401 years ago. So environmental racism was being challenged and looked at in 1979. Before that was an environmental justice movement. And so it was isolated what we were doing in Houston. And I'll end by saying we went to the environmental groups, the green groups, back in 79, and I showed them those data. And they basically said to me, isn't that where the landfill is supposed to be? Isn't that where the garbage is supposed to be dumped? We went to the oldest civil rights organization in the country. I won't call any names, but we all know the initials. And they said, we don't work on environment. We don't work on, environmental racism, environmental discrimination. We work on housing discrimination, education, voting, and employment. So it took 25 years for the environmental movement and the civil rights movement to converge, even though Dr. King went to Memphis, Tennessee in 1968 and on an environmental economic justice issue, and he was killed. But for some reason, we forgot. Our civil rights movement forgot that this was a civil rights issue that Dr. King was killed over in April of 1960, in April 1968.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Some excellent points. And I wanted to just stick a pin in a couple of things you said, because we're going to touch on these more as we go along. But when both you and Ms. Shepherd talk about, okay, so we did the studies and we did the research, and then we came back and we showed that, but you make it sound so simple, but that right there, right? Yeah, that right there takes so much effort, coordination, getting the right people to do the right things, and can take so long. So, as we talk further, I think that's going to come out some more. If it doesn't, make sure it does. And then the other thing that you kind of hint at, but, when we think about, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about clarification of terms, when you think about, who suffers environmental injustice, you think about poor communities of color, but it almost sounds like it's not just poor communities of color, it's communities of color. And so when we come to our clarification of terms, which we will do after we have this discussion here about defining moments, let's make sure we touch on those topics. Thank you so much. And now Miss Rebecca Bratspies, please, let's hear a little bit about what brought you to the environmental justice space.
Well, I grew up in a steel town in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and the air quality depended on the way the wind was blowing. Some days it was really good, and some days it wasn't. So I grew up enmeshed in environmental issues. I always was really interested in, I always wanted to be an environmental advocate. As I got older, I sort of noticed things that maybe as a child I didn't see in terms of, I grew up in a steel town. The union, right, it was a union town. The union was almost all white. It was very intentionally had kept out many, many workers of color. It was all men. And those were the good jobs in town. So who had access to resources in terms of employment was very much tied to race and gender. And of course, we all were bearing the burdens that were externalized on the community in terms of pollution. So I went to law school because I wanted to fight for the environment. I wanted to help people have a clean environment. And I naively thought, apparently this is a radical concept, but I thought everybody had the right to breathe clean air. And that was not what I learned in law school. That's not what environmental law was about. It was not about making sure everybody had the right to breathe clean air or the right to drink clean water. And then I read Dr. Bullard's book. And let me just say what an honor it is to be on this panel with Dr. Bullard and with Peggy Shepherd. They're both environmental justice heroes, and I'm so honored to be on the same panel with them. And I realized that this was a place where I could devote my talents and maybe make a difference in terms of raising the profile of the fact that if everybody has the right to breathe clean air, that means everybody. That means every child. That doesn't mean part of society, and the rest of society should bear the burden. We all are entitled to the same start in life. We're all entitled to the same access to environmental quality. And I'm particularly interested in young people. Most of my work is with law students who then go out and sort of are wonderful environmental lawyers. And I also work with schools around New York City, especially in Queens where I live. And we're building the next generation of urban environmental leaders, people who understand about environmental advocacy, who have these incredible skills and ability to express themselves and demand their rights. And it's inspiring to see.
Thank you. And I think that what's extremely exciting about what you do is that, you know, you're making this discipline and an awareness of it, but the discipline a lot more accessible to young people through your comic books, your coloring books, and talking on things that, you know, your last coloring book, your most current one, is on the census, and you talk about that as a social justice issue, and, you know, the importance of completing the census as a social justice issue that really impacts the environment in which we live.
Yeah, well, not only, could I just take a second to make a pitch about the census? Because not only does the census drive political representation at the national level and at the state level, but every environmental justice analysis, the analyses that Dr. Bullard was talking about and that Peggy was doing, right, they rely on census data. We need to have a good count so we can see who is it that's living near these locally undesirable facilities. Without that good count, we can't make that case.
Excellent, brilliant. Okay, so that really kind of is a nice transition into the next kind of questions and pieces of information we want to address, and that is, you know, clarification of terms. When people talk about the environment, as Barbara mentioned at the outset, you know, what comes to mind often is green space, trees, tree huggers, but it's about more than that. And when we talk about it in light of or in the context of the environmental justice space, there seems to be a whole vocabulary that people are using and terminology that people need to become aware of and be consistent about. So let's spend a few minutes defining terms and clarifying terms. Terms like, what is the environment? When we say environmental justice, what does that mean? What is environmental racism? And what do we mean by sustainability? So, you know, I'd like to begin by defining what do we mean by the environment, you know, and I put that out to the group. Anyone who'd like to begin certainly can.
So for me, the environment, or let me start out with environmental justice. It's a civil rights analysis of environmental decision-making. It's discrimination in the enforcement of laws, deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste disposal and industrial facilities, the permitting of polluting facilities in overburdened communities, the lack of diversity of people of color on the staff and boards of mainstream environmental organizations, decision-making boards, regulatory bodies. And environmental racism is really a system of power, of formal and informal structures within government, within nonprofits and philanthropy that really assigns value to certain groups and communities. And as Dr. Bullard says, and he's here to say it for himself, we do not have the complexion for protection.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Dr. Bullard, do you want to pick up from there?
Sure. I think, let me just take a crack at environment.
Okay.
The environment for many years and for decades was defined as nature and outdoors and the hinterland and wildlands. And for many years, somehow people were not part of that, and particularly people of color were not part of the larger environment as it got played out, and in many cases were excluded in many ways in terms of the enjoyment of nature. So in 1991, at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, we decided to lay out a new framework and a definition of environment. The environment is everything. It's where we live, work, play, worship, learn, as well as the physical and natural world. So that doesn't leave a whole lot out. And when we include policy and how things, the bad things and the good things get distributed, then we talk about adding another component, which is justice. And for a long time, publishers and government would not accept the fact and the reality that you could use justice and environment in the same sentence. And we would always get this whole pushback. Well, you know, the environment is neutral. Everybody's, you know, is basically experienced the same whatever. And we said, no, wrong. And so the environmental justice framework basically says that all communities are entitled to equal protection. And if you put it in a legal or framework in terms of who gets what, then entitled to equal protection and enforcement of our laws and regulations, whether it's environmental law or health law or housing or transportation, energy, food security, whatever. And so our definition of environment is inclusive, as well as our environmental justice definition that, as Peggy said, comes out of civil rights, human rights context, and brings into the fold also how people are also connected to place and how it's connected to a larger ecosystem and the ecology of how all of us are part of this larger system. And not just say, well, the environment is something to be dominated, controlled, and for condominiums.
And dare I ask, how would any one of you, and then we'll move on, would you define environmental racism?
Well, environmental racism is the intentional targeting of communities of color and low-income communities because they're less informed, less politically active, and often because land is also cheaper. But of course, the elites in our communities, whether they're at city planning commissions or zoning boards, they're the ones who obviously work with developers and ensure that industrial pollution is put in our communities. And a lot of people ask, well, is it really about income or race? And somebody just asked that to me today. And we know that because of historical segregation, middle class Black people live in communities with a diversity of other Black people with in terms of income. And so we know that the primary predictor of where toxic waste site will be located is a community of color and secondarily a low-income community. So environmental racism is just another manifestation of that continuum that we already are living, whether it's housing segregation, criminal injustice, police brutality, poor education, redlining from banks. It's really a continuum of racism in all sectors of our lives. And in this sector, it is about the environmental conditions in which we live.
Yeah. Just to piggyback, Peggy, on this, the two examples that we gave that got us into this whole realm were the neighborhoods, communities were not poverty pockets, low-income ghettos. And last time I checked, I think West Harlem was not a poverty pocket, or Northwood Manor was not. It was a middle-class Black suburban neighborhood. And if you talk about race trumping class in almost all situations, middle-income African Americans who make $50,000 to $60,000. I know that's nothing in New York, but here in Houston, that's the middle-class income. Middle-income Blacks who make $50,000 to $60,000 nationally live in neighborhoods that are more polluted than whites who make $10,000. You say, how can that be? Housing segregation, residential apartheid, and systemic racism. It's easier for a low-income white family to dress up and go and look for housing in a middle-income white neighborhood than it is for a middle-income African-American or middle-income person of color to go and look for and dress up and go and look for the same type of housing and get turned down, already rented, house sold. That's how racism permeates in terms of who gets the best of the best and who gets the worst of the worst. It's not just cheap land, cheap low-income areas. It's also because land values and property values, market forces make it artificial. And we have what's called gentrification. Something that was worthless 20 years ago can be very valuable because of the market saying, I want this. Or people saying, I don't want to live out there anymore. It's too damn far out there. I want to be close in. That's all. And who has the power to say, yes, we're going to make it possible for you to live close in. And if you are not the right complexion for protection, then you got to get the hell out. And if you don't want to leave and you don't own, you're going to get pushed out. Now, that's the way of the world. And that's what we've been fighting, that systemic racism that has permeated mortgage lending, banking, and insurance, housing markets, who gets grocery stores and who gets fast food killer joints. That's what we've been talking about. Not just the bad stuff, but who gets a fair share of the good stuff that's make us healthy.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing to what Dr. Bullard said? And because a lot of times the systemic racism gets cloaked in language neutrality, and it's really important not to let that happen. Just for example, New York City is out of compliance with the ozone standards under the Clean Air Act. Right? The Clean Air Act sets standards that are requisite to protect the public health with an adequate margin of safety. New York doesn't meet that. For most of July, we've had air quality warning days. The air quality has either been moderate, which is at risk for unusually sensitive people, or unhealthy for sensitive populations. That sounds like it's something that's going to affect everybody. But if you look at who the sensitive populations are, they're children, they're older people, and they're people with lung issues. And if we look at who has asthma in New York City, who has cardiopulmonary illness in New York City, it is much, much more prevalent in communities of color because of the environmental pollution that pervades those communities. So all of this neutral language about the impact that's affecting New York City, it hides the fact that communities of color are much more vulnerable to the ozone air quality days that we've been having just about every day in July, and we'll probably have them just about every day in August.
And much more vulnerable to COVID-19, but that's another
Yes.
discussion for another day. I'm going to turn the floor over to Barbara Brown, who's going to talk a little bit about the legal components here.
Yeah, so the question is, where does legal and environment intersect? Do we have a legal right to environmental justice? Because now we've framed out what environmental justice is, but where do we stand in terms of the law and environmental justice? What does the law say about environmental justice and environmental racism? And to what degree are the laws enforced? And I guess why? So if we could just kind of unwrap that a little bit, and maybe I will start with Rebecca, and anybody else can jump in who wants to.
Well, the text of the laws are, are often pretty good, but we have beautiful civil rights laws. They've been gutted, right? If you look at the language of Title VI, if you look at the language of Title IV, it should provide us with environmental protection. But the way the Supreme Court has interpreted, unless you can prove intentional discrimination, and what that means is it's not even enough if you have the kind of evidence that Dr. Bullard had of overwhelming disparate impact. Unless you can find smoking guns like we found in the census case, where you had a series of emails back and forth highlighting the racial animus behind the attempt to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census at the last minute. Unless you have that kind of evidence, courts don't want to hear it. And that's a huge problem. For those of you who are law students who are listening, this is an important place to direct your attention, because these laws are created by us. They can be different. They can be interpreted differently. They can be interpreted so that they achieve their ends, but that takes the committed work of lawyers working in solidarity with communities. And that's what I think we're starting to see that. I think we're seeing it more and more. And I am optimistic that with the next administration, we will move forward towards laws that realize environmental justice.
Okay, so yes.
Let me just add. I have over the last 40 years, I've served as an expert witness on dozens of lawsuits, and on housing and transportation, industrial facility siting, and highways and trying to make sure that transit dollars go to in a way that's non-discriminatory. And some have been lawsuits, some have been administrative complaints. Again, lawsuits almost always are a last resort. If you can get negotiations and get upfront the kinds of work that needs to be done to stop something before they even start putting it in the ground, it's easier to get a win. But laws are only as good as they are enforced. And if you are in a state that has, in some cases, a somewhat progressive DEQ or DEP, State Department of Environmental Protection. Like here in Texas, our TCEQ is our state agency, and it's never met a permit it didn't like. It's like it's a rubber stamp on permits, and it's because we're in a Petropolis here in Houston, and we're in an oil and gas state. So it makes it very difficult to win cases like that. And so what we have to do is working together with lawyers and with our experts in doing the research and with our policy folks to string things out. And the longer you string it out, the more money it costs the companies to try to fight you. And in many cases we have won, but in many cases we have lost because of it's not a level playing field. You're fighting your state government and you're fighting the company, and sometimes you can't tell the difference between the two. And so it means that we have to understand that if you go on a legal route, a lawsuit, that this is a long-term kind of thing, that if you don't have the longevity and the stamina to hang in there for, 10 years, 15 years or whatever, then your company can see, those companies can see your weakness, that you're only in it for 2 years and you're tired and you're going to throw up your hands and say, damn, we can't fight anymore. But if you can hang in there and bring in the second team and bring in the third team, 15 years, 20 years or so like that, then there's a good chance that you can outlast them. In many cases, a lot of these companies, and in some cases, when you're trying to get these permits, because it means millions and millions of dollars, they try to outlast you and wait for communities that are sick and who can't fight to die. That's hard to say, but that's a reality that we're in today. They wait for you to quit or die. And what we say, never will we say throw up our hands and just say, oh, I've resigned myself to die for them to kill us and to choke us to death with all these polluting facilities that's creating bad air. We can't breathe. And that today we're seeing the convergence of a lot of the I can't breathe and Black Lives Matter, and that all of it is connected. It's the same systemic racism that's choking us by police and choking us by these chemical companies.
That's an excellent point. And so you're saying, I'm hearing you say that moving the needle on enforcement, it just takes sheer persistence and people on the ground realizing that you can fight City Hall, but to fight City Hall, you have to stay in it. You have to stay in it. You can't throw up your hands. Very often we tell people on the local level that if you they're waiting for us to say, well, we can't do it, or it's impossible, or they're going to win, so why bother? So that was an excellent point that you made. There is supposed to be the NEPA guidelines that are supposed to be there to make it possible for communities to be engaged and be consulted on projects that negatively impact on the environment. How effective do you see those guidelines as, and what about the Trump administration and that administration's impact on those guidelines, on the National Environmental Protection Policy Act? What do you see happening there?
Well, we had hoped to be strengthening NEPA and not trying to ensure that it's not rolled back. So what it means is that communities will not have the opportunity or robust opportunity to weigh in on large infrastructure projects. We did see the last vestiges of NEPA have the ability to at least temporarily stop the Atlantic Pipeline and the Keystone XL pipeline. But those were primarily stopped on procedural issues, and they could be that work could be resumed. There's a lot of problems with NEPA. It's really a disclosure kind of act. So it means that if you have a large project, you have to disclose what you think the impacts will be. And then the community gets an opportunity, 30 to 45 days, to assess 1,000 pages that is a totally technical document. So right away, NEPA is not particularly community friendly. And of course, that thousands of pages has been developed with hundreds of thousands of dollars by engineering firms and consultants that the industrial facility is paying for. So we know also now that we're more online and there won't be in-person hearings, that distribution of documents, if at all, will be done online. And of course, many of our community folks do not have very good access online. So again, that cuts down on the information. So there are a lot of elements that have been taken out of NEPA now that will make it very, very difficult for communities to engage in a process that was already very difficult. And I'm sure, Rebecca, you're an expert on NEPA. We've been talking about NEPA, it seems like, for the last few weeks. But yeah, it was an imperfect act. And we'd hope to strengthen it. And perhaps in the new administration, we will have that opportunity to do that.
Can I just add that NEPA doesn't have to just be procedural? Again, that was a court interpreting the statute. There are good arguments that when it was drafted, it was intended to be substantive. It was intended not just for people to prevent uninformed environmental decision-making, but also to prevent unwise environmental decision-making. Courts have rejected that claim, but that doesn't mean that moving forward, we can't think about NEPA as having a substantive requirement that the environmental policy of the United States be that people have the right to breathe clean air. Obviously, that's a huge change, but we're in the process of changing NEPA, so let's think big about changing it. The one thing I would add is that one of the biggest impacts the United States has had around the world in the environmental context has been environmental analysis under NEPA. Right? That has been adopted around the world as a vital first step. The International Court of Justice has recognized it as customary international law that there must be consultation with communities and there must be environmental impact analysis. The idea that the United States, the originator of this idea, is backing away from it is such a travesty. And we have to make it, I don't know, we have to change things.
Yeah.
We all need to vote. Everybody needs to vote.
Yeah, I think the fact that NEPA was a tool, even though it's flawed and even though it got reinterpreted in a different way than I think it could have had much more power, even with the NEPA prior to 1994 and the executive order that Clinton signed. None of the environmental justice analysis or the racial justice analysis was included. And after 94, there was a requirement for an environmental justice analysis, looking at race and income as impacts in health, et cetera. And even with, after 1994, there were some cases where NEPA was being applied that we were able to stop permits from being granted using analysis, NEPA analysis, environmental impact assessments, and comment period. And one example was in 1989, Louisiana Energy Services was trying to locate the nation's first privately owned uranium enrichment plant. Now, why in the hell do we need an enrichment plant? It was just a boondoggle. Anyway, when we challenged that in 1989, and from 89 to 97, 96 or 97, it took that many years to go through the in front of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And we were able to block that permit and defeat it. And that plant was never built in the middle of these two little Black communities in Northwest Louisiana. The impact assessment was so flawed that they missed two communities in their analysis. Said there's nothing out there where this plant was going was jackrabbits and trees, even though there were two Black communities. One had been there since 1865 and the other one had been there since 1910. And we were able to show in the analysis, the environmental justice analysis part of NEPA, that this thing was just nothing, that was just rigged up, and it was just nothing but just a C- graduate paper, even with grade inflation. And we were able to get the 3-judge panel to throw it out. And that community is still nothing out there except trees and Black people who own their lands, jackrabbits and peace, as opposed to a uranium enrichment plant. So there are some examples where you can win, but it's difficult. It's difficult. In many cases, you have to have just arrogant people putting together proposals for some type of operation development that they think that they can get it just because they're putting it in a place where they don't expect people to fight. That company spent $35 million, and over 9 years, we bankrupted them. And most of us who did the work on these projects, they got us at the best rate, experts at the best rate you can get pro bono, but we won.
Another weakness that we see with NEPA and any kind of environmental assessment is that they're not looking at cumulative impacts. They're taking impacts one by one. So that, for instance, in Southeast Queens, JFK Airport is one of the major polluters and a whole host of related businesses to the airport. But right now, the airport has a $13 billion redevelopment project. And so there is an assessment for a good chunk of that project. But all along, they have been making that airport ready for this redevelopment project. So there have been, for instance, each runway that has been redone was done under a separate EA. So, and when we asked for a 5-year plan, for a 10-year plan, where are you going with all of this? There were no real responses. We were told there wasn't any plan. And every time something negative comes into the neighborhood, it's evaluated just as that tiny little project. And so how do we get to a point where we can really make the powers that be look at the cumulative impact? I mean, if you know where you're going with something, you should be taking in the totality. And how do we negotiate that? Anybody?
Let me just say, you're right. We don't have that. That's what we have been fighting for the last 40 years, looking at cumulative impact and synergistic impact, and looking at what exists there and what the toxic load is, and what an additional permit or an additional facility or an additional development project will take place. We don't have that today, and for many years we did not even have the methodology for even assessing that. That's what we were told. But we have we've made good progress in assessing those cumulative impacts. But again, it's one thing to be able to assess the impacts. It's another to be able to put something in place to say, well, can these cumulative impacts trigger some type of threshold mechanism to stop something or to ratchet down the impacts? And we don't have that yet. I know the folks in New Jersey trying to put together a cumulative impact assessment in terms of environmental justice, and I think it's moving through the legislature. But there's nothing like that in the country.
Mhm.
Some state has to be first, and I think the idea that this is coming from communities. You made that statement, and most of the people on the ground know that you need to know what all is going on in a community, not just this one runway or this one particular development, because all of it adds up, and in many cases 2 + 2 equals more than 4, because you're talking about, when you start, it's not just additive, it's also the synergy.
Mhm.
How all these chemicals and all these impacts
Mhm.
is damaging health, and that's a flaw in our policy. It's a flaw in our laws, and those are big gaps that we need to keep fighting to get. And at the national level, we're going to have to fight. And so, who's in the White House and who's at EPA and who's in the governor's office? It really does make a difference. You just can't say, well, it won't make a difference. It will make a difference if you got the right people to push for this. And as we push up, in terms of grassroots pushing up, then have people at the policy level that are actually pushing down. And as we meet to talk about health, and health is what we're talking about.
Right. And that's a good segue into the next section, the intersectionality between environmental justice and health and the Black Lives Movement. And how do you see the environmental justice movement intersecting with the Black Lives Movement? How do you see it intersecting with health disparities and racial inequities? What has been your experience with communities advocating for environmental justice in terms of all of that?
Well, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is really about another aspect of racism that we all experience. Again, it's a continuum of police brutality, housing segregation, banking redlining, and environmental racism. So we all feel a kinship to all of those social justice movements, and we're all a part of that larger movement around Black lives mattering in all aspects of our lives. And, the environmental justice movement has always placed health at the center of environmental struggles, because we know that our physical environments and the zip code in which we live really play an important part, and they're a key determinant of African American health. We know that environmental exposures are a key contributor to, are one of the social determinants of health that contribute to escalating health disparities. And we have seen the impact and the linkage between air pollution, sensitive populations, and the high prevalence of mortality and morbidity with COVID-19 by African Americans. So we all understand that link to health disparities. But of course, we don't have the health equity that we need. And it's not just that we don't have health insurance, because in many communities, there is a very high level of people with health insurance. The issue is, when they use that insurance and go to their doctor, are they getting an equitable assessment and treatment? Mm-hmm. Or is, the white brother or sister down the street, are they the ones getting the new medication, the new methodology, the new surgery, and the Black person is getting, just a basic treatment or medication? So the racism, why we're talking about health equity is because there's racism in the health sector. As Bob talked earlier about whether, a Black and white person with the same credit rating go for an apartment, which one is going to get it? Well, it's the same with health. If you both go and you're equal, which one is going to get the better treatment, the better medication? So the health equity issue is a really important one that's impacting our community. And of course, if we go and look at COVID, we know that many of our communities are frontline workers. And those frontline workers are not being properly compensated. They should be getting hazard duty pay. When they have died, some of them shockingly without health insurance, their families are now getting a huge bill. And then when they die, why aren't they getting some sort of insurance as our thank you and appreciation for the fact that they have worked to keep all of us safe, but have given up their lives for that. And then, of course, as Bob can tell you as well, I mean, there's just a whole host of studies that show the impact of environmental exposures on pregnant women, on the developing fetus, on the development of the child, and that some of these toxins can develop a genetic alteration in children, and it could be intergenerational. So the studies are just prolific on the impact of environmental exposure on health.
And at our next forum, that's going to be a topic that we explore. Dr. Bullard or Professor Bratspies, anything on this?
Yeah, I just like to say that it's very, I guess it's very encouraging to see Black Lives Matter and young people embracing environmental justice and trying to dismantle environmental racism. Because if we only try to do criminal justice and policing and not deal with what you're breathing in the air and what you're drinking in the water and what you're eating in your food and what's in your neighborhood that's not only killing you, but killing your economic development and killing your transformative wealth, then you have missed the whole boat. And so it's good to see our movements converging, and with the I guess the thing that's bringing it all together is dismantling systemic racism and recognizing how it permeates the criminal justice system, the health system, the housing, the education, the voting, and you start naming all those systems, and you say, well, if we are to create this intergenerational movement for justice, then we have to have a lot of the issues that may not have been on the radar of an organization, but we have to put it on there because it connects.
Exactly.
And I think that's the good thing about what's going on right now, and seeing how, for example, people who worked on housing, and now seeing that what happened 100 years ago in racial redlining is also showing up in terms of issues around urban heat islands, and people who talk about climate. Well, where you think the hottest part of the city is the areas that was redlined 100 years ago. Or if you look at COVID-19 hotspots, it's the same areas that were redlined, 100 years ago. And so making those connections and showing that where COVID hotspots and where voter suppression and how consolidation of polling places, all that has to do with how we have to attack these things in a holistic way and say, yes, I'm working on voting and working on civic engagement. I'm working on health. I'm working on transportation. I'm working on housing. I'm working on food security, trying to make sure that people have healthy schools, all of these things. We don't have to be experts in everything, but we do need to know people who are working on these issues, and we need to have at least a common language and a common kind of understanding that this also is my issue. Even though I may not be the best expert on it, but this is my issue. And to say, yes, I'm an environmentalist because I breathe air, I drink water, and I eat food. And I care what's in the water, what's in the air, and what's in my food. And I may not be a member of that green group, but I am concerned about my organizations or my church or whatever. That's why we started. Let me see. No, back up. That's why we relaunched the National Black Environmental Justice Network, because of these converging issues that's hitting our communities at the same time. These rollbacks in environmental protection, trying to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, looking at voter suppression, looking at all these issues that's coming at us at the same time. And we can't just be, can't have the luxury of just saying, well, I'm just worried about trees. I'm just worried about parks. We have to be worried about all those things. Trees are important. Green space is important. All these things are important. And so we have to work together. And we got lots of young people and lots of groups that are working on this stuff. And so we have to join and get politicized and mobilized.
Absolutely. Professor Bratspies, did you want to add anything to this?
I just want to echo Dr. Bullard and Peggy Shepherd that Black Lives Matters is at the core of dismantling systemic racism that has tentacles in all of these different areas that intersect with each other, in housing, in healthcare, in banking, in access to education, and they all converge. They all converge around the environment as well as anything else. If you look in New York City, where are the power plants? Where is the polluting industry? The peaker plants, the ones that are going on now in July and August because it's so hot and our energy demands are shooting up, they're all in communities of color. They were placed in communities of color, many of them in 2000, others before then, intentionally knowing that they were all being put in communities of color. Those are the communities that don't have equal access to air conditioning. They're bearing the burden of the dirtiest plants in the city, and they don't even get the benefit of, and you know, you look upon around vector after vector after vector of social oppression, and you see that same story. And I think that Black Lives Matter is a moment where all of America has to see that. You know, maybe Black America knew that. White America could look away. They can't right now. They can't because they're home, and they can't because it's so damn visible that they have to see it. And that means that there's a moment where we can try to build solidarity and we can try to build change.
Exactly. Thank you. And so we're going to be moving on to our next topic with Gloria Boyce-Charles.
Climate change.
Climate change, yes.
Climate change. You know, we're going to move along a little bit because we have quite a few questions in the chat, and we do want people to have an opportunity to air those questions. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't point to climate change and try to bring some, shine a light on that. I think a lot of times in communities of color, the topic may take a back seat to other social and economic issues in our communities. But the impacts of climate change really are going to be even more severe in environmental justice communities. When you look at the heat wave today and how that may be impacting us, that's climate change. And what does that look like? So here's my question. Can you explain why the impacts of climate change may be more severe for environmental justice communities? And what will that look like? What does it look like today? How might that look in the future? What should we be doing about climate change now?
Well, we know that climate change in communities of color is now on top of a legacy of pollution. Mm-hmm. So extreme weather events have a very different trajectory in our communities than in more affluent communities. I don't think a lot of us in New York City have forgotten about Hurricane Sandy. No. And how most of the public housing, or all of the public housing that's at the waterfront, and a great deal of our public housing is at the waterfront, how those folks were out of electricity for 2 weeks. They had flooding. it's been 8 years and the repairs still haven't been made in many of those buildings in terms of mold and other issues. And so we already know that when you have a legacy of pollution, climate change and extreme weather events, whether it's sea level rise and flooding, whether it's extreme heat, is going to have an outsized impact on an already vulnerable population, and vulnerable in the way that we've already been talking about today. And we know that climate change will hit vulnerable communities the worst and the first. And what should we be doing? We all need to be organizing a climate action plan in our neighborhoods. If you talk about just regular people, what could we be doing? We organized 400 community residents to develop a Northern Manhattan climate action plan. And the community prioritized those issues. And I was actually surprised that their priority was energy security. Now, we know that 30 million households in this country are energy insecure. We know that 50% of public housing residents in New York City do not have access to air conditioning. And some of the ones who might do not have the funds to pay for the electric bill to run that air conditioning. So in many cases, you know, I've talked to scientists who say air conditioning should be a prescription for certain populations and for certain vulnerable folks. So again, during COVID, we find the instance that we're asked to stay at home, yet we've got 90-degree weather outside and we have those extreme temperatures. And so the city has stepped up a bit. They've given out thousands of air conditioners, but they're not paying for those bills. So, you know, we've been focused on LIHEAP, which is pretty much, you know, a subsidy for heating, primarily for seniors and other subsidized folks. And now we're saying it can't be just heating, but it's also got to be about cooling. And so how do we begin to develop policies that really ensure that we can address that? You know, shouldn't every landlord, for instance, develop a cooling center in that apartment? Can they renovate, whether it's the laundry room or some aspect of that building, to provide a cooling center? Because the idea that New York City has these cooling centers that, number one, are voluntarily run. These people, community groups, are not compensated. You don't know when they're open. You don't know where they are. And so if you've got 90-degree weather, you're really asking a senior citizen to leave their apartment and walk blocks away to get to a cooling center, which may not be open, which may not have refreshment, which may not have any amenities. And of course, seniors, you know, are kind of stubborn and a little paranoid, rightfully so. And they don't want to leave the safety of their home or what they perceive as the safety. So climate change will really impact all of our communities every year from extreme heat, more so than sea level rise and flooding. And so we really have to begin to address that. But I think every community should develop a climate action plan and an emergency management plan for how they will communicate with these kinds of energy outages and other kinds of impacts from climate change.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? I know that
I live in Houston, Texas, in the Gulf Coast, and we're ground zero for climate change. Even though we're in a state that that denies the existence of climate change in terms of our leadership, in terms of our governor and other folks at the state level, but we've had 3 500-year floods back to back to back, and we've had more intense hurricanes that are rain bombs that stay out into the Gulf and sit and the water is hot, and then they move on shore slowly, 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 and dump water. And Hurricane Harvey was one of those rain bombs, and it dumped 53 inches of water over a few days and drowned our city. And the idea that we have to have, we meaning our environmental justice communities, like Peggy said, must have a plan to deal with climate change. In this case, we're talking these severe weather events that's becoming more frequent and more and stronger and stronger, and the damage that's occurring, and the idea that our heat waves. Now it was 95 degrees today in Houston, but that's nothing here. 80 and 90% humidity. That we're used to that, but it's going to get hotter, and it's going to get too hot to work outside. And who do you think that's going to impact most? Who works outside?
Right.
Mostly people of color. And so it's going to get too hot to work. That means if we can't work, we don't get paid. And so with the COVID-19 going on right now, and with the federal government, Donald Trump basically saying FEMA and COVID, we're going to have new guidance, and it means that FEMA may not show up. There may not be any rescue going on because you can't shelter in place at these big convention centers and big places, and you can't social distance. So shelter in place at home. Now, if in the last 3 years you've sheltered in place at home and you got 5 feet of water or 12 feet of water, shelter at home is basically dying at home and drowning at home. So we have to have a plan. So we have this HBCU Gulf Coast Equity Coalition. Is that we partner with our HBCUs, historically black colleges, and our community-based organization in 5 states across the Gulf Coast. And we are developing plans with our communities, because if the government doesn't show up, we need communities to have their plan in terms of evacuation, in terms of who are homebound, who are people who don't have cars, who are people that can't communicate via the internet. And so we have to do it because we know the government's not going to do it. And it means it takes resources. And so it means that we're having to develop proposals and trying to get funding for our consortium. And we're saying our black colleges need to take the lead on this because we are located on the front line of the climate change. And it's not like we're over here and the climate change is over there. That's how we're developing those partnerships. And our consortia got young people, got our faculty members, got our students, and our Peggy is on our board, and she comes down to New Orleans. We have all our meetings in New Orleans. We can't have it in person now, so we're doing it virtual. So that means you have to be creative, innovative, and be forward thinking and aggressive about this work, because climate change is happening right now. It's not something that we got to wait 12 years or 25 years from now. It's happening right now. And so we have to be ready right now and with plans right now, and force our city to come up with climate action plans, come up with plans to talk about how we're going to deal with flooding, and how we're going to deal with how the money's going to get spent. And all the money can't just be spent where the rich white people are. We have to fight that. Every day is a fight, every day is a struggle, so that we have to replenish our ranks with other folks who are not tired and who are not somehow pessimistic that you can't do. You have to have optimism in this work. And you have to say, yes, we're going to kick some butt and we're going to win. And we don't always win, but we have hope that our North Star is that we're gonna unpack all these things that have kept us from getting those things that we know make us healthy, livable, sustainable, and resilient. Now that's the plan. As my father said, in the absence of a plan, your plan is a plan. And most times there's no plan. Or the plan is to let us drown, and we say no, not to that.
Excellent. Ms. Bratspies.
Yeah, can I just throw in 2 plans that people could get involved in here in New York City? One is renewable Rikers. When Rikers is shut, right, there's a plan before City Council right now to convert it to sustainable energy generation and storage in order to remove the peaker plants from communities of color. it's a chance to transform the way energy is generated in New York City and to right old wrongs in terms of where these plants were located in the first place. And it ties into, right, criminal justice reform and recognizing that the communities that bear the brunt of the pollution from the peaker plants and from so many other polluting facilities are the ones that bore the brunt of police brutality and bore the brunt of mass incarceration. And it's a way to begin some kind of a restorative process. I would encourage everybody to get involved in the Renewable Rikers Project. I know that WeAct is deeply involved in that. And the other sort of more immediate thing that's happening that I would really encourage people to pay attention to right now is one of the peaker plants, it happens to be in my neighborhood, is right now going through a comment period for a proposal to expand and transform it. It's the Astoria Repowering Project through NRG. There's absolutely no reason for us to have a fossil fuel burning peaker plant being built and expanded now. We should be looking beyond that to solar, to wind, to battery storage, to pollution-free sustainable energy. And they need to hear that from everybody. And then once we're in this transition to sustainable and renewable energy, we need to make sure it's a just transition. We need to make sure that we are not just recreating that same racial economic hierarchy that captured benefits and directed them to wealthy elites and white communities. And it also builds into the resilience ideas in terms of communities having their own power, communities having access to power that isn't mediated by some large corporation that doesn't care about them at all. And it provides job training for our young people. Solar installer and wind turbine technician are the two fastest growing job categories in the United States. From a really small base, but they are the fastest growing job categories. We need to make sure that our frontline communities, the communities of color, are part of that, that our young people are being trained so that they can have those good jobs of the future, to install those clean technologies in their communities, as well as everywhere else.
That's great, thank you. It sounds like that is the subject or a lot of content for a future forum, really, to learn more about and how we can support. And also, you know, I feel like in our communities, we really need to be thinking about how we want to work with our electeds to make sure that we have a climate change plan in place. And there ought to be platforms that we're looking for our electeds to include. Action items we're looking for them to include in their platforms in these respects. Here in Southeast Queens, we are working with the Office of Emergency Management to develop an emergency plan. So I think that more and more communities are doing things like that, but it is an urgent need, and you can't move fast enough to take these things into account. I thank you all for your responses to this, and I'm going to suggest that we move into the chat and question and answer section. Barbara, would you agree? I do want people to have an opportunity to ask their questions because we have quite a few here on the line. Are you on mute, Barbara?
I'm not anymore.
Okay, yeah. Okay,
Yeah, so we can take a few of those questions, yes.
Yeah.
And one of the first questions is, what can be done to make the EPA more effective? I hear chuckling.
Different administrator.
Well, you know, we've had effective administrators. We had Lisa Jackson under the Obama administration, and she said environmental justice was her priority. And we had no Title VI cases being adjudicated. You know, environmental justice was not integrated into all aspects of the agency. The National Environmental Justice Advisory Council to the EPA has not been effective for 25 years, Bob, at least. So, I'm hoping that Biden, he's got a good plan out, at least a plan that gets us started. But unless the administrator is really going to put people in place in the deputy administrator positions who really are committed to environmental justice, it just does not filter down to the medium level, moderate level staff. Mm-hmm. And so we're hoping that the White House Council on Environmental Quality will be stepped up. Maybe it'll be a White House Council on Environmental Quality and Environmental Justice. We're hoping that there will be senior advisors in the White House to get past that giant EPA bureaucracy. But I don't know, Bob, what do you think? I mean, we've seen Obama and we've seen Lisa Jackson. I mean, what are we going to do?
Yeah, I think we have to see environmental justice beyond EPA, because when it was originally laid out, there were 13 agencies that were charged with looking at environmental justice. You know, there's a whole lot of environmental justice at DOT. Mm-hmm. And when we had Rodney Slater at DOT, you know, there was a lot of environmental justice that was being done. As relates, as a matter of fact, he said it's not enough just to have an executive order. They had a DOT order, environmental justice. Yeah. So it makes a difference who's in those. At the Department of Energy, you know, at housing, at HUD, at education. So environmental justice need to cut across a whole, you know, all those 13 agencies and given priority, and not just, you know, ghettoize over in EPA and let EPA take all the heat. NIHS, for example, National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, made the call to do environmental justice, and you know, it's a premier biomedical research institute, and it made the commitment to put money into environmental justice and creating grants and partnerships to expand resources to organizations, grassroots organizations, partnering with universities, et cetera. So there's a lot of work, important kind of work that could be leveraged depending on if you get the right people in these institutes and in these departments and in the regions. You know, EPA has 10 regions, and if you get crazy people operating the regions, it's almost like doesn't matter who's at headquarters. And I live in Region 6, and I used to live in Region 4, Atlanta and Dallas. And these are states that were former Confederate states, and Jim Crow, still flying the flag. And so do you think we're going to get any environmental justice down here in Dixie? No, we can't even get justice. And environment, no. It's almost like a low priority on the list. And so it matters who's the regional administrator and who's making that call to say, well, we're going to make sure we appoint people who are going to make change, transformative change, as opposed to just little baby steps. Time for baby steps is over. We need big, giant, transformative change that's going to overturn a lot of the stuff that we've been waiting to happen. And that's what we should be demanding. And no less. That's what we should be demanding.
This next question is, I guess, near and dear to the hearts of people in Southeast Queens, because we have an international airport at our footsteps, and we've been trying to get air and noise studies to really determine to what levels people are actually being exposed to. So the question is, research and data is so important in our community. We need the data to justify the argument. In our community, air quality studies and other studies need to be done. How can we get these studies done in our community? So any advice from our experts?
Let me just give you an anecdote. Go find the people and the studies that were done for Reagan Airport, and find out what they used the justification for not coming in at certain times and having to fly certain angles. I know the example without having a study, but again, sometimes you don't really need a study when you know the answer. The answer is some powerful communities and people will not let flight patterns and landing patterns and noise interrupt with their community, and they will mitigate, and cost won't be the holdup. So it might sound cynical, but it might take more political organizing and mobilization in addition to having those kinds of studies. And again, we did something like that in Atlanta when they were building the 5th runway, and we got the ear of the county commissioners for South Fulton County, where mostly Black, middle class folks live, and we got enough political clout to change the alignment of flights coming in and the kinds of and the times and the kinds of frequency. And of course we had a study, but it wasn't a study that got the change. It was political muscle, raw political muscle and raw power. And if you ain't got the juice, then you got to have a powerful study.
And of course, we already have powerful studies on numerous chronic disease. And of course, they're in a peer-reviewed journal and nothing is changing. And it's because there's no political organizing around some of those issues. So unless you all are willing to go up and camp out at the governor's office and stay there overnight for many days and get, very good media coverage, your chances aren't great. You've got to be organized politically, and then you've got to have the political moment. You've got to have the window of opportunity. As long as we've got a Republican president, or if you have a Republican governor or Republican mayor or Republican Senate and a Democratic Assembly, nothing is going to happen. So
FAA
is have that political moment and the organizing.
And FAA is particularly challenging because they don't care. They view themselves as part of this huge national project, and they really don't care what the local community thinks. But we are at a moment where air traffic is changing. We're at a moment where what was doesn't have to be what is. And, if we couple that with political change, that can be something that, communities organize around, communities near airports. I know there's a network of the communities near airports. If what you organize for is in the new administration, and notice how much of this hinges on in the new administration, but organized for FAA to have people appointed who are attuned to this issue, that's a possibility. And the other thing I just want to make a plug is reach out to CUNY. I mean, I got involved in some of the LaGuardia noise issues because I got a call from a community activist who said, hey, I know you teach environmental justice. Could we be your class project? There are, the CUNYs want to be part of the communities. So we're a great resource. NYU is a good resource, Columbia is a good resource, but because we're CUNY, because we are the city of New York, we can be a real partner in this kind of, especially the data gathering and organizing and report writing part of it, that can be the basis for the political organization that could drive change.
Well, thank you. We definitely will be reaching out to you. And the Eastern Queens Alliance does have a small grant from the state to do an air quality study and a noise study, and to look at where the noise and the air pollution intersect. What we have been calling for is a large comprehensive study looking at air quality and health and noise, because we know from all the research that we've been gathering that those kinds of issues that emanate from large airports are real environmental justice concerns, and they need to be addressed. So we are moving forward on that. But I have a lot of notes here: political organizing, need, political moment, opportunity, and several other statements. And Dr. Bullard, we will look at the Atlanta and the Reagan airport issues.
You might also reach out to the New York City Environmental Justice Advisory Committee that Peggy chairs and see if it can be put on the agenda somehow in terms of the issues that the advisory panel is considering.
Okay, great.
And
Thank you.
hire a community organizer. Find money at one of the, like New York Community Trust, and hire a community organizer.
Okay, thank you.
Barbara, I'm just wondering if you'd like for me to wrap up now. It's almost 9 o'clock.
Yeah, was there another question that you saw?
No, I think we 8:55, and so I just wanted to basically wrap up a little bit by saying that, because all the questions are in the chat, and I think everybody can see the chat ongoing, our panelists as well as others. And there's a lot of great commentary there. There's commentary about some suggestions about some other issues, and we can look at them and do some follow-up on our end. I think that one of the things that has come out of this is that, as we hear all of the different ways that we're impacted in our own communities, I think we need to now probably take all of this information, these experiences that have been shared with us, these suggestions, this wonderful advice, and go back into our communities, share it, and think in terms of, what does that mean in terms of next steps within our own communities? And I certainly know that we do that constantly in our community. And we'll continue to do so. And out of this may come some ideas for some future forums, virtual forums that we may do. And so we want to thank you so much, Ms. Rebecca Bratspies, Dr. Robert Bullard, and Ms. Peggy Shepherd for joining us this evening. And I want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, that Ms. Bratspies and Ms. Shepherd are both, have both been honored by the Eastern Queens Alliance in previous years with our Snowy Egret Award. Because we value and hold in high regard, such high regard, their work in the environmental justice space. And this year, the honor goes to Dr. Robert Bullard. So we will be having our virtual fundraiser. It was going to be a live in-person one on April 15th or 20th or something, but the point is moot because it was not to be. But we're going to do a virtual one on October 15th, and we hope you'll join us, and everybody here will get some information about that, and we're going to have a wonderful time. And Dr. Robert Bullard is one of our honorees, as is Miss Nicole Hannah Jones. We're building a new environmental science center, and through grants from the Parks Department and Queensborough president, that was Helen Marshall, right? And more recently, some additional funding from Melinda Katz. And the building is up, and it's almost finished, and we're looking forward to moving in maybe in the beginning of the new year, and we're looking to put some exhibits in. So if you, you know, if you find it in your heart, donations are welcome. We want to, you know, we want to build exhibits and have a science center that serves the whole community and beyond, to educate about the importance of taking care of our environment and the importance of sustainability, which is a lot of what we've been talking about this evening. And there's a lot of good we can do, and we look forward to doing it. And we thank you so much for your help in the past and anything you'd wish to offer in the future. You can see more of us on Facebook, on our Facebook page, Eastern Queens Alliance, Inc., or at our website, www.easternqueensalliance.org. And Barbara, would you like to add anything to that at this point?
No, I just want to repeat your thank yous to Dr. Bullard and Professor Bratspies and Peggy Shepherd for really sharing all of your wisdom with us and giving us a lot of food for thought. And so thank you very much. And I want to thank all of the attendees. And we will be reaching out to you with the further information about other topics in the series. I know the very next topic is the unholy link between COVID-19 and health. And so that we're planning to do at the end of, towards the end of August. I think, Gloria, did you say the date is August 20?
I think it's the 27th, but you'll get.
27th, but we'll be getting information out about that. So we're continuing in the same mode. That's another piece of the discussion, and we expect that that's going to be a robust discussion. So thank you all, and thank you all for attending. And we will be reading, going back to your questions. I know there is a teacher here who asked about how she could get her kids to participate in data collection, and definitely we will be reaching out to her. And there's some other really good questions that we will reach out to individuals on. So thank you, and good night.
Thanks to all participants as well. Thank you, and to our co-hosts who helped us to make this evening possible. Thank you all.
And thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Be well, stay safe. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.